First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes celibacy. Of the many fairy tales we get swept in, a sexless marriage, definitely not one of them. My next guest was a successful healthcare lawyer married to an attorney with 2 children. She lived in a beautiful home in New York City as well as a sexless marriage. At age 45 and no sex for 26 years, she considered sex as something she was just done with until experiencing her own sexual healing and awakening in 2011. She then transitioned her career to become a full-time sex and intimacy educator. Now, she has a host of certifications, including being a certified Somatica sex and intimacy coach and leading intimacy retreats to help couples use a variety of modalities to connect on all levels. Today, she's going to share her story and talk solutions as we ask the question, can a sexless marriage survive? Believing pleasure is a birthright, promoting creativity and curiosity, Xanet Pailet. I'm so happy you are here.
Thank you, Meredith. I am so excited to have this conversation with you. I don't think I've ever been asked this question before in an interview, so I'm so delighted that you're asking this really important question.
Yeah, that's kind of what we do here is ask the questions people think, but they might be too embarrassed to ask about, and they might be too embarrassed to Google. And even if they did Google them, Google's not really going to give them great results. So I definitely want to hear your personal story. But before we get into that, can we just define what a sexless marriage is?
Absolutely. So the official definition of a sexless marriage is a couple that has sex less than 10 times a year. That's the official definition of a sexless marriage. To me, depending on the circumstances, I would probably define that as a sex-deprived marriage, but not really a sexless marriage. When I work with couples in sexless marriages, which I do a lot, they literally haven't touched each other for 3 years, 4 years, 2 years, ever. Like nothing, not even like anniversary sex. So, there's some variation here in terms of what a sexless marriage really is.
It seems like there's some variation in defining what sex is as well.
100%, right? So most people define sex as basically intercourse. We call it penis and vagina sex. But that's not my definition of sex. I think that's part of the problem in our culture is that, we're so goal-oriented and it's just about intercourse. It's just about the orgasm, as opposed to can we just enjoy the journey and not worry about the destination? Think about sex as this huge smorgasbord of all of these different possibilities in ways in which you could have some sort of erotic connection.
So for the purpose of our listener, when you and I are talking in this moment about sex, we're talking smorgasbord sex, not PIV sex. Okay.
Yes,
I mean, it could
100%.
also be P in the V, but it's the smorgasbord. Okay, great.
100%.
The charcuterie board of sex, if you will.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Anyone can tell someone what to do or a way of thinking, but I think it brings it to a new level of credibility when that person also has a personal story attached, like you do. So tell me your personal story. Paint a picture for me of what your home life was when you were married.
Complicated, I guess I would say. There were a lot of different elements of it. We were on the surface, we were like this amazing couple. Very strong family life, great parents, did a lot of things together. But behind closed doors, things were not okay in any way, shape, or form. There were a lot of issues, and a lot of it stemmed from me of having painful intercourse. Penetration was extremely painful for me, and that goes back from my childhood, for some childhood trauma that I actually had. But I didn't really know what was actually going on. And so ultimately, sex just became so much drama between myself and my ex-husband that we were just like, we're done. I'm done. I was done. I don't know about him, but I was definitely at some point after our second child was born, I was just like, doesn't feel good. I never have had an orgasm. I end up crying. We end up fighting every time we try to have any type of sex. And for me, at that point, sex only meant PIV, because that's all I actually knew. I was, all of 26, 24 years old when I got married. So it was very challenging, and it was kind of a relief for me when we stopped having sex or even tried to have sex. But underneath that, there was never good communication between the two of us. In retrospect, I know that like my emotional needs were actually never met by my husband. So I never really felt that emotional connection to him. And, we just grew further and further apart to the point where we were sleeping in separate bedrooms in our little 1,400 square foot New York apartment. One of us would be in one of our kids' bunk beds, and the other one would be in the master bedroom. And then just the relationship just kept on falling further and further apart. That's a common type of trajectory that happens for a lot of couples.
I think you're right. And I only know that from the little bit of conversation I was able to have with some folks who were so gracious to be open with me about this prior to us getting on the call. And because it's so common, I have a couple of follow-up questions. And if any of them are too personal, just, tell me.
I will.
We can skip over them.
Nothing's off the table with me, Meredith. For all
Okay.
in my books, if nothing's off the table.
Okay.
Go
Glad to
for
hear
it.
it. So a couple of clarifying questions. One about, you said sex was really painful for you
Mhm.
and that you viewed sex as only PIV sex. So does that mean that there was no self sex for you either? It was just completely nothing, nothing.
Yeah, I did not even masturbate until I turned maybe 47 or 48.
Wow.
hmm That's the first time I remember having an orgasm, and it's the first time that I masturbated. I was just very uncomfortable with my body and very uncomfortable with my sexuality and felt very disconnected with my whole genitals. It just was like, oh, I don't want to go there.
That's such a big difference than where you're at now
I
and that you've
know.
made a whole career out of it. That's really hopeful. I hope people get that already, even though we're like just barely into this conversation. The second clarifying question I wanted to ask you was about the trauma that you experienced and its manifestation in your body and in your relationship. How long before you became aware that there was a connection between the pain that you were having and the trauma that you had had?
Wow. Okay. So that didn't happen until I was, somewhere in my early 50s. And I already had started going through some of my sexual awakening through Tantra and sacred sexuality, which was my doorway in. And I was at a conference with women, a women's conference, or I don't know, we were together with a group of women. And there was a beautiful circle, and people were sharing about some of their trauma. And I recognized, like, oh, wow, I can now put these two and two together. Like, something happened when I was a child, which wasn't physical abuse. It was actually a little incident I had with my Yorkshire Terrier dog, where he was actually licking my genitals, and it felt good. And I was young, but I was also super anxious, and I knew that this was bad. Like, in my mind, right? I just knew this is bad. If my mother found out, this is going to be a problem. And so there was so much anxiety that got coupled with the pleasure, which is what often happens, right? In a trauma response, there's a coupling that happens. So in this case, the anxiety of like, oh my God, I'm going to get caught, got coupled with the pleasure. They sort of got interwoven, and I could never separate it again. Right. So anytime somebody went to touch my genitals, I went into a freeze, which again is a very common response. So that was one piece of it. And the second piece of it was one of the reasons we stopped having sex is I had a ton of UTIs when I was in my 20s. And I had a lot of very painful procedures at the hands of urologists. And again, like I was like, oh, wow, I've had like medical trauma that I never put two and two together and recognized that was part of it. Like my vagina was just like, no, I'm going to protect you. I'm going to close down. I don't want anybody to touch you because every time you get touched, you get hurt.
We had a couple of listeners send in questions in regards to medical trauma, as you put it. I hadn't even put those two words together, but that fits. And I'll ask those questions later in
Yeah.
word for word because I really want them to get answered by you directly. But because we did have 2 people send in medical questions, I have a feeling there's a lot more who didn't send in questions who have them. Because of that, would you be comfortable, or maybe do you even remember the name of the procedures that you got? Because you're in such a good place now. I think what happens is when people have like a medical related trauma, or just there's a before and after. Before said medical procedure, I was great. After said medical procedure, I wasn't great. And therefore, they interpret their new experience of sex as permanent,
Yeah, for sure.
and for you,
Absolutely.
it wasn't. So, do you remember the names of some of the procedures that they did?
Well, I mean, I know lots of different procedures that impact women's sexualities. I don't remember the name of what they did. They don't do this anymore, but they would basically, what they used to do is they would take a dilator and they would put a dilator in your urethra and keep on trying to stretch it to create more space, right?
Oh my.
I know
Okay.
it was very painful. I don't think they do that anymore. I think they've realized that's really kind of a very brutal procedure. I'm not sure how they treat it differently, but I don't think they do that anymore. But that's one thing that happened. A lot of women, though, have medical trauma from episiotomies during childbirth. There's like a maybe 3rd or 4th degree tear in the perineum, and that creates a lot of scar tissue, which can create a lot of painful sex. Any type of abdominal surgery, cesarean section, anything, related to that. Again, what happens, it creates scar tissue. It moves some of the organs around that also can create a lot of painful sex. A very traumatic childbirth can also, even with or without an episiotomy, can also create a lot of trauma, which also can create more painful sex, whether it's actually healed or not. The thing about trauma is it lives in your body. And the body has this memory of like pain, or the body has this memory of contraction. This body goes into a freeze place. So those are very common experiences that women in particular have around sexual trauma, and men have it as well, right? For men that have had, some men who've had prostate surgery can have, physical trauma, medical trauma around that. Men who have sometimes like a failed vasectomy. I have a client who had a reversal of his vasectomy to try to get pregnant with his second wife. And, he has just been really in a lot of pain and discomfort. Sex has been really painful and hard for him. Right. So, anytime we're messing around with, our genitals, where there's so many nerve endings and scar tissue forms so easily, we're likely to disrupt the flow of blood, the sensation as well. So it's not, unfortunately, not at all uncommon, but not talked about a lot.
Have you read any research about the connection between male circumcision and sexual performance?
That's an issue as well, right? So we know that men who are not circumcised have a lot more nerve endings. The sheath actually has a ton of nerve endings. And when that sheath is removed during circumcision, you actually lose quite a bit of sensation. So I've been with male lovers who are circumcised versus those who are not circumcised. The ones who are not circumcised tend to have a lot more sensation than those who are circumcised. And I think that's something that society is starting to recognize now, that we did it for hygienic reasons, but really, they don't do it in Europe. They don't do it in most other countries. So yes,
Yeah.
that's a thing as well, unfortunately.
Are there any medical procedures, male or female, that would cause a permanent negative sexual situation? Or are they all redeemable?
No, it really depends. It's hard to say, right? Physiologically, there are procedures that can really harm you 100%, right? I've had clients who have had like surgery on their genitals, either because they were trying to do a labiaplasty, which is to, change the shape of the labia because they weren't happy with what it looked like. And they ended up having just kind of permanent scarring and a lot of pelvic pain. So most things are redeemable, but it may involve a lot of different components. It might involve a really good pelvic floor physical therapist, right? There may also be, and usually is, an emotional or trauma piece to it as well that we need to work with at the same time. But there are some things that happen to people during surgery. Maybe it needed to happen, to save their life or for cancer remediation or whatever, that can definitely have a permanent scar that is pretty, it's not going to change. That doesn't mean that they can't have pleasure and they can't have sex in other ways, but, maybe they'll never really be able to have a really hard erection again, or, something along those lines. It's possible for sure.
I really
Unfortunately.
hadn't it is unfortunate, but I love that, your own story is so significant, how, because you said sexless, what did I say in the intro? 26 years. So, and that meant at some point that was like zero, nothing, you said.
Right.
And so that's such a dramatic story to have such a comeback from, that I think it can give people the hope to try. But I hadn't considered, prior to researching for our episode, the connection between the emotional state of the person and what's going on with their sex life. And that seems like a real obvious thing. I don't know why I didn't connect it. But when you said in another interview that if a woman is resentful towards her husband, it can cause pain during sex, that was the sentence that I was like, oh my gosh, I never even thought of that.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely, because, just thinking about our sexuality from a whole body perspective, right? Our emotional part of our body, a physical part of our body, everything is so interconnected. And for women, especially, this is true for men too. I hate to make these broad generalizations, but I know this to be particularly true for women. When women are feeling not emotionally safe, not emotionally connected to their partner, shut down, their body doesn't respond, right? If I'm feeling disconnected and you're trying to arouse me, there's no juices flowing. There's nothing happening. I might be able to sustain having intercourse, but it may be really painful and uncomfortable because I'm not aroused and I'm not turned on because I'm angry at you and I'm feeling emotionally disconnected and I'm just doing it out of service, out of obligation, as opposed to because I really want to be there because I'm a hell yes in this interaction.
I interviewed Dr. Kate Mangino. Are you familiar with her work? She
Not
does
sure.
gender studies.
Okay.
She's fascinating. I feel like the two of you would get along great. But we talked about what happens in a relationship when one partner acts as a parent to the other partner. Like the examples that we gave were, let's say, these are from sitcoms, really. The wife sneaks off to purchase things and then hides them from the husband, and or the husband gives the wife an allowance, or the husband purposely does the chores incorrectly so he doesn't have to do them anymore, so she has to like monitor him, and it really is like a boner killer in the relationship.
Yeah.
But I could see where resentment could also be a factor, not just in an obvious way where we automatically go to the department of like infidelity, right? But that sort of resentment could come up in a situation where one person is parenting the other.
Yeah. And that happens a lot in relationships. There's definitely a tendency to parent your partner, to criticize them, right? Like we're triggering
Mhm.
their core wounds because hard to admit it, but essentially we end up like getting in relationship with somebody who was like one of our parents because
Mm.
that's what was actually modeled to us. And so I mean, that's something I did in my relationship with my husband. I just tried to take care of him and he was so overprotected by his mother. And I tried to do the same thing, overprotect him as well. And that was I think that was part of the loss of our intimacy and our connection, which was like, he just wasn't showing up for me in a strong masculine way, the way I really want a man to show up. And I wasn't allowing that to happen because I was just mothering him to death, trying to take care of everything. And those are the type of things that happen in relationships over time that end up leading to sexless marriages. That is definitely a very common path, right? Because I'm not going to get turned on. Either the male in the relationship isn't going to get turned on because they don't want to have sex with their mother.
I mean, if they
Usually,
do,
what they
that's
do,
another
well, that's a
set
different
of problems.
conversation, right? That's a fetish. We can understand that. You can play that out in role play.
You're
And
so sweet. I can tell you're an intimacy coordinator. I'm sorry, listener. That I cringed. I can't help it. Work with Xanet. She's professional.
and the woman similarly is like, I don't want to I want him to take control. But if I cut off his balls, essentially, not going to happen. That's a very common dynamic where things start to really fall apart.
You mentioned in another interview that you did that you felt that your masculine approach in your profession bled into your family life, and that contributed to the downfall of your romantic relationship.
Yes, as a lawyer, I mean, we were both lawyers, but, I probably had, in retrospect, I can say this, I had stronger masculine energy. I still have masculine energy. I just learned how to find my feminine side more, my surrender side. But that was definitely a part. We were lacking that polarity, right? We were lacking that. And I think polarity is really important. How it shows up in the relationship can vary, right? It doesn't matter if the woman holds the masculine and the man holds the feminine and everybody's happy with that. Right. And in many times it is. In my current relationship, we play in the world of kink quite a bit. And, I'm a switch. So sometimes I hold the feminine, which is mostly my preference, but sometimes I hold the masculine as well. Right. But if that's the only dynamic, if two people, if that's not what you want, then again, you start feeling resentful because in my intimate life, I want a strong man. I want somebody to take me. That's my passion. That's my desire. Not everyone's, but I would say a lot of women actually like that. And a lot of men have a hard time actually allowing themselves to do that for a variety of different reasons, which we heard about a lot in I just came back from a retreat in Costa Rica with 12 couples, and this came up in conversation. And a lot of the men said, like, well, the reason we don't do this is because we get rejected. And once we get rejected, we're not going to do it again because we don't want to get rejected again. Right. So there's all of this dynamic, and it's all as a result of not having good communication with your partner about what you want, what your needs are, what your desires are, how you want to be touched, how you want to be kissed, how you want to be made love to. Like all of that, will really tamp down all of these areas in which there's a lot of challenges.
So, how would you suggest that a woman who has worked very diligently to create a career and is powerful in that role, how would you suggest that she prevent those unwanted masculine energies and those unwanted moments from leaking into her relationship?
First of all, you have to be really aware of it. You are holding this kind of energy, and you have to make a very conscious effort during sex to let it go, to not try to, as we say in the kink world, top from the bottom, to let it go and to let your partner give them explicit permission. Tell your partner, like, I want you to be your fully animalistic, passionate person. And I give you full permission to touch me in a way that you want to touch me, unless I have boundaries, in which we'll have a conversation about that. And I promise you that if something doesn't feel good, right, I will say something. But giving your partner explicit permission about what you want, and giving, especially in a female male relationship, giving the men permission, like, you can do this. I can, in my current relationship, in my last relationship, I had to tell my partner over and over again, like, you can do this. I'm giving you permission. You can tie me up. You can, flap my butt. You can devour me. You can ravish me. That's what I want. And I'm not going to slap you in the face, because men are afraid of that. They're afraid of that because of the legal system. They're afraid of that because of the way they've been socialized. And they're afraid of it because women haven't been willing to allow them to go there and accept that.
Yeah. That's interesting. I've had a couple of conversations with, all three of my male friends. I don't have many, but and they have shared that the challenge for them in areas of consent has been in more casual sexual relationships where they double checked, they triple checked, are you okay? I'm okay. Are we okay? And then later, they like 3 days, 4 days later, they'd get a message back that said that wasn't cool. And so I could see where there's a variety of situations that would put kind of men on guard. And as you said, with humans, when you're on guard and you're tense, then that really causes a lot of problems. I want to ask you, though, is a sexless marriage always the canary in the coal mine for the relationship? Or is it possible that there are just marriages where both parties are genuinely and honestly happy and there's no sex?
Yeah. So I always tell my couples, if everybody agrees that they don't want to have sex and everybody's happy about it, truly happy about it, in my worldview, either like your friends, and you're great roommates, or, you're great partners in every part of your life except for your sex life, and neither one of you really care about it, that's totally cool. Go live your life, enjoy yourselves, have fun. The problem, though, is that so much of the time, one partner does want to have sex, right? And their desire is getting quashed. And that's when the resentment starts to really build up. And that's typically the dynamic. I have seen some couples that are totally happy like that. Absolutely. To me, they're the exception to the rule. But, generally speaking, they might be a little bit on the older side. They're maybe in their 60s. I'm in my 60s, in their 70s or 80s. I don't know. I know a lot of 80-year-olds that are very active sexually. So you don't want to make broad generalizations about that.
No. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I feel like you would know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I also spoke with a woman who works as a coach for other women, both in nutritional areas and hormonal areas. And the word on the street is that there are many women who are not having sex in their marriage once a month or fewer times. And they just don't care. It's just not, they were like, I don't need to research this. I don't need to read about it. I don't need to listen to a podcast about it. I'm totally fine with it. That and end of story. Is this true?
I think that I've seen these women. They show up in my office sometimes reluctantly because their partner drags them in. A lot of times it's because they're going through menopause. And for some women, menopause becomes the big excuse to stop having sex, right? And for me, if I really dig down and have a conversation with them and talk deeply with them, what I learn is that they've never really had good sex. They've either had a lot of obligation sex where they just felt like they had to have sex. And typically this is just very short, 5-10 minute PIV sex, or it was all about their partner having to please them, give them oral sex, and their needs weren't really getting met. They didn't ever feel like their partner knew how to touch them in a way that they wanted. They were never able to even understand for themselves and express what their own true desires are for sex, right? And so I'll talk to you about a couple that I had just pretty recently here in Asheville for a retreat. And well, they were kind of having sex, like maybe once a month, maybe once every 6 weeks. And she was going, I'm not that interested in it, but I'm here because I'm concerned that it's going to mess up our marriage, which is a lot of reasons people come see me. They're like absolutely at their end of the rope. We tried this, we tried that. We've been to sex therapists, we've been to therapists. We're trying something different is what I often hear. But once got into it and she got to be able to really explore all of these different types of styles of sex, like the kinky style and the more passionate style and the more sensual style and what that really meant. And her partner just wanted to please her, right? A lot of men, I'm not going to say all, but a lot of men just want to please their partner. They want to make them feel good, but they're just clueless. They don't know really how to do it. They think they do, because they've seen it on porn, they've seen it on movies, but they really don't know because nobody has been given this education, this language of all of these different ways in which we can connect with each other. So she ended up having they had an amazing weekend. They had sex a bunch of times. They tried new things. I talked to her talked to them a month later, which I always do. And they're like, oh my God, everything's great. We went to this store and we bought all these different toys. And, so I think a lot of it is you don't know what you don't know, right? And you never had a great experience with sex, or you had a great experience when you were 20 with some random person, but you never got to actually replicate that again. Then you're just I'm done. I'd rather, read a book. I'd rather watch Netflix than just sit here and have shitty sex. Doesn't feel good, right? If it doesn't feel good, why do it?
Well, it's work.
It's work, right? It's obligation, it's work.
Yeah.
And I find I see that a lot, Meredith. And I'll give you another example, another story. This was an interesting story. This was a couple that came, they were in pretty much a sexless marriage. They'd been married, 30 years, something like that. And she was just I had no desire, nothing, right? And we worked all weekend and we tried different things. And I got them to kiss a little bit and do a couple of things, interact in ways they haven't really interacted in a long time. But I could tell she wasn't really into it. There are a lot of other relationship issues in this marriage. And I got a call from her 2 years later. And she was like, we're divorced, we're separated. And I met this new person and we want to come and do another retreat with you because I really want to make sure that sex is really good from the beginning. And I was like, well, that's fantastic. How's your sex life? Are you even desiring sex? She's like, oh my God, we have sex all the time. I am so horny all the time, right? So it happens a lot, right? When, and that's again, the way in which sometimes you're in this very toxic relationship where you haven't had good communication and you just can't do anything about it, but end it. And then you think you're done. You think you're through menopause and you're finished and you have no sex drive. And then you meet somebody else, and you have a completely different context of that relationship. And your sex drive all of a sudden comes right back. And I see that all the time, right? So, excuses.
Well, I really love what you said. You don't know what you don't know. And in my view, the beginning of all real change is to be able to look at your behavior, the behavior of the people around you, your situation as data. And then that's kind of a nerdy way to do it. But if you look at your situation like information, then it takes the judgment out of it. It takes I should be doing this, we should be doing that. It takes all of that out. And I don't know what I don't know is a great way to frame what otherwise might feel scary, or you might feel like you would fail, or, whatever the case may be. So that's really beautiful. I hope that my listeners get a lot out of that as well. So the big question of the hour is, can a sexless marriage survive?
Absolutely. Let's distinguish between a sexless marriage where both parties decide that they just really don't want to have sex and they're cool with that, versus a sexless marriage where they do want connection. Maybe one has a higher desire than the other, but they do want connection. So the answer is, of course, it can survive. It takes work. It's not going to happen overnight. You haven't had sex in 5 years and then all of a sudden you're going to have sex again. No, because it's going to feel weird. It's going to feel awkward. That's what couples will say to me, oh, the thought of touching his naked body feels really weird to me again. But of course it can survive, but it's going to take work. It's going to take intention. It's going to take making the relationship, the sexual, the intimate part of it a priority. You're going to have to start slowly. When, couples come to me, they're really and truly what I consider a sexless marriage. It's not like we dive right in. We're actually working first on, and again, typically a sexless marriage is a symptom of a dysfunctional relationship, almost always. There's some dysfunction in that relationship. There's some way in which I'm not feeling emotionally safe. So for first and foremost, working on creating that emotional safety in a relationship whether it's doing a retreat with me or working with a really good therapist to really get to a place where you can start to talk to each other, be vulnerable with each other, because almost always there's a lot of underlying resentments on both sides that have to be worked through. And my approach is in a very vulnerable way, which is super scary for people. Oh my God, I'm going to have to be vulnerable. But vulnerability creates intimacy. That connection creates intimacy. And then very slowly, once you're starting to feel like we can start to talk to each other, we can be honest and authentic with each other. We're not going to be using our words against each other. We're not going to continue to invalidate each other's feelings, which is a big reason that people start getting in conflicts and relationships become very challenging. Is constant invalidation, gaslighting. Could go through a million different pieces of it. Then we start to slowly connect with each other. For me, that's like we start to like hold hands. We start to look in each other's eyes, right? We start to do some very, gentle touch. We start to do exercises around like, how would you like to touch me for 3 minutes? Am I okay with that? What boundaries do I have around that? And sort of taking turns, slowly moving into connection. But it's process.
Hey there, it looks like you're enjoying this episode so far. Since you appreciate nuance and curiosity, I'd like to officially invite you to my private Facebook group. And there you can give me direct feedback on episodes, ask questions like the ones featured in this episode, vote on future topics, and participate in giveaways. Search MFR Curious Insiders on Facebook or click the link in the show notes to request to join. It's free. Okay, back to the show. So it sounds like you're saying a sexless marriage can survive if both people are happy with no sex, or you are trying to find your way back to sex.
100%.
But just hoping that, oh, this is fine and I'm fine. I'm never going to ask my partner if they think it's fine too. Probably not an excellent plan.
No, definitely not an excellent plan. You really do need to, and let's be honest, sex is like Pandora's box. It's like the third rail in politics, right? It opens up this whole set of issues that people are really afraid to open up. And there's a lot of emotions around it because there's ways in which, in a sexless marriage, both people feel really deprived. Maybe they even feel abandoned because, they're not getting the attention, they're not feeling desired, probably triggers some childhood wounds of maybe not feeling desired by your parents or feeling abandoned. There's a whole lot of ways in which that could happen. But yes, that the answer is you've got to talk about it. If it's really important, you've got to make it front and center conversation. And if you can't do it yourself, which most people can't, then you've got to go seek help with somebody who really can help support you around it.
Is there a specific shelf life for a sexless marriage? A listener sent this question in. They wanted to know, at what point is it a gone case? Or at what point should I just expect my partner to be getting it elsewhere?
That's a great question. I would say there's no rule of thumb here. I think it is very situational dependent. But let's see. In my retreats, I worked with a couple who hadn't had sex for 7 or 8 years, which maybe is the longest that I've worked with anybody just individually. And I got them to a point where they were starting to reconnect with each other, right? And it was hard, though. It felt very awkward for them. It can be hard to come back from. Again, it just kind of depends on what else is underneath. Like if you're really good friends and you can really talk to each other about everything else but sex, then I think there's not such a long shelf life. And I think there's a longer shelf life, right? I think if there's a lot of issues in the marriage, in the relationship, then the shelf life becomes a lot short, right?
That's a good way to word that. Yeah. Another listener wanted to ask you about the prevalence of sexless marriages across cultures. He sent me an article about sexless couples in Japan, that the percentage of couples not having sex there is a lot higher for some reason. Have you noticed any trends among different cultures in your retreats?
I wish I could say I had a lot of different cultures in my retreats. I have not. I mean, when I was in the Bay Area in California and I worked with a lot of Asians because it's the Bay Area, it's a high Asian population. I did definitely notice that people seem to be a lot more generally shut down sexually. Like the socialization that they had in some ways was even more culturally inappropriate than some of the socialization that we've had. But I definitely suspect that there are cultural differences in what elder relationships, and say elder, like long-term relationships look like and what the expectations are. Now, one thing let's not forget about Japan in particular is that there's a very high prevalence of men having sex outside of the marriage in Japan. That is very well known.
Oh,
So, yeah.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Almost all of them have mistresses. There's lots of prostitutes in Japan. That's a very well known fact. So, I don't know about China, but definitely true for Japan in particular. And so maybe that doesn't resonate as much with me because, yeah, sometimes you're getting your needs met outside of the relationship, which, by the
Yeah, well,
way,
like,
yeah, which I want to say, by the way, sometimes I do recommend that, and I did just had a client fire me because I recommended that, but they were essentially in a sexless marriage. And I suggested that they either open up the marriage because it didn't seem like anything was going to happen on one side, or that the partner who really wanted sex go and get sex outside of the marriage, but tell his partner that he was going to do it. And that is sometimes a viable option depending upon what's going on, particularly if there's a physical disability or your partner is just like, that's okay, go get your rocks out someplace else. I'm totally cool with it. I love you. Not going to have an effect on me. I have seen that work at times. So,
yeah, it does. That is also Pandora's box. It brings up the question, what style of monogamy are you practicing in your marriage, which can be a very uncomfortable conversation. I did an episode about this with a psychotherapist who's also a swinger in Canada, and she was talking about, how people assume they know what monogamy is, but it's like we all have our own version of it in our head, and you don't figure out that you have a different version than what your partner has imagined until something goes wrong. So, yeah, that I think if you were in a sexless marriage and you're like, yep, I'm good, never going to happen ever again, that might be a good conversation to have with your partner. Like, okay, well, then what does that mean? And it's a good conversation to have regardless, I think. But another question that I had for you was about same sex partnerships. How common is it for sexless marriages to exist within same sex partnerships?
so I don't work with a lot of gay men, so I can't answer it from the perspective of the gay man perspective. What I have a lot of gay male friends, and what I know about at least my friends, even if they're in a monogamous relationship, there tends to be a lot of fluidity. There's, other lovers and other partners, more, I don't even know, I wouldn't even call it poly. It's just kind of a gay lifestyle. I think it's different from what I've seen, not again, broad generalizations here in the lesbian population. At least the lesbians I know and the couples I've worked with tend to be very monogamous by and large. And they have some of the similar problems as hetero couples have as well, in terms of things starting to slow down or get boring. Sometimes, depending again on the polarity between the partners, if you have two women who have very feminine energy, that might be fun for a while. But if you're somebody who desires more of that masculine, somebody take charge energy, that can get challenging. Just like if you have, well, maybe not so much if you have two like more butch women, I mean, it could just get very animalistic. But, depending on whether that polarity exists, for some people, they don't need polarity, but I find that most people like a little bit of polarity to be able to mix that feminine and that masculine. I think whether we're straight or gay, we're having some of the same issues underlying a sexless marriage, which is lack of communication, lack of emotional safety. A gay couple that I worked with most recently, who came here for a retreat, now they're getting married. or just got married, I think, there just wasn't a ton of emotional safety there. And we just had to spend a lot of time talking about the emotional safety. And then we got into more of the physical aspects of intimacy, which is how I typically run my retreats.
I love that. I want to dive in before we run out of time because this has been so fun. I want to dive into some listener questions. And one of them is asking about, is there a correlation or causation between porn and gaming and sexless marriages?
Porn and gaming. Oh, that's a big question. So both of them can be addictive behaviors. I think they're different, right? I think you'd have to look at each one a little bit differently. Gaming, I look at more as like, that's an addictive behavior. You're having an experience outside of your body. It's dissociative in some ways, right? Like you're on a screen, you're not having human connection with somebody. So coming into intimate connection can, if you really are like over the top in gaming, it'd be really interesting to see what happens with this next generation of kids, Generation Z. Like my partner is a 13-year-old who's just totally invested in virtual games. And I'm just like, wow, how do you connect with somebody? So I think that's a question. In terms of porn, I'm not anti-porn. I think sometimes porn is great. I think it, for many men and women, it can be a turn on. My concern around porn always is like, is it preventing you from connecting with your partner? Is it getting to a point where it's becoming very addictive? And of course, it's unrealistic. So, boys, men who grow up watching porn think that like sex is just putting something in a hole. And that's not what sex is, but that's what they've been socialized to believe by watching a lot of porn.
Yeah. Another listener wants to know how much sex is normal for married couples. Is that amount consistent throughout the relationship or does it ebb and flow?
Oh, okay. Well, every couple is different. I had a couple here a couple of weeks ago where they are normally having sex 2 to 3 times a day, and they were in their 50s and 60s.
A day?
A
My
day,
goodness.
right? And it definitely ebbs and flows, right? Because all of the things that affect our desire for sex, our obligations, our work obligations, stress, what else is going on in our life, right? How we feel about our partner definitely ebbs and flows. If you have young children, good Lord, the couples that come that have 3-year-olds, like if they can find half an hour to have sex while the baby, the child is napping, they're lucky, right? So it definitely ebbs and flows, and that's normal. There's nothing abnormal about that. What's important is to keep the communication going, like, oh, and maybe decide, like, if you do have a kid, can we get the in-laws to watch them for a night and we go to a hotel for a night? And, again, putting the relationship as a priority, which is hard when you have other competing priorities, including aging parents, right? There's lots of things that can affect our sex life if we're not really conscious about it and we don't make it a priority.
Mm. Another listener says that 30 years plus, they have had a quote, a very active sex life that turned off like a switch when her husband had a testicular cyst and a surgery to remove that. She asks, how do you regain that intimacy when the problem is a health issue?
So that may be not sure what that's affecting. If he had like a cyst in his testicles, whether that's affecting his ability to have an erection. I'm not a urologist, so I don't know. I think you think about sex as this huge smorgasbord, right? And there's lots of different ways to experience pleasure and to give your partner pleasure that doesn't necessarily involve penis in vagina, or a man having to have an erection, or, a man having to have an orgasm, right? I mean, I know that sounds almost brutal, but it's true. Sometimes when there is a physical issue, a physical disability, and that does happen, right? We have to really relook at like, how do we have connection? How do we have pleasure? There's lots of different ways to have pleasure.
So, would you suggest that they, as a couple, speak with his urologist to find out what the actual medical implications are in order to separate it from the psychological impact?
For sure, because, I don't know what the medical implications are, but I would definitely find out what the medical implications are. And then I would look at if medical implications are not really, it shouldn't affect your erection, right? Most men who have ED, most men, again, broad generalizations, is psychological. It's not physiological. I mean, definitely erections change as men age, harder to get them, maybe harder to sustain them. But for a lot of men, it's psychological. It's like, I'm not feeling good about myself. I'm not feeling sexy. Just the same for women. I'm not feeling good about my body. I'm not feeling sexy. It's going to be hard for me to have an orgasm. It's going to be hard for me to open myself up sexually if I'm not feeling good about myself. So, but a lot of sexual dysfunction has a psychological element to it. And that surgery could have been traumatic for him, right? It might have made him feel like he's lost his manhood. I don't know.
Yeah. Oh, and that I don't feel like our society supports men in with the same enthusiasm that it supports women who don't feel sexy. Like men, I just feel like they just get muted in that area. It's like they care about what they look like and they want to feel wanted and yeah. So I who knows what happened, but
Yeah.
that's some great advice. So and
Yeah.
I'm glad that we brought that up.
Yeah.
I have
Think it's,
another yeah, I have another medical question, this time from a woman. And she says, due to a very bad surgery, I can no longer have sex. It's been 11 years, no sex. We're still married. I'm only 49. I think the frustration just got to be too much for my husband, and now he doesn't even want it anymore. The frustration is real. Acceptance seems the only option. She didn't ask a question, but I would love for you to address that.
yeah. So that's a real issue, right? And again, when she's defining sex, she's talking about penis and vagina, right? Does that mean that she can't have a clitoral orgasm? I don't know, right? There's, this whole erectile network on our bodies, men's bodies and women's bodies that can feel pleasure. Women can have a nipple orgasm. Women can have an eargasm. Like pretty much any part of our body can be orgasmic. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the genitals. That couple, they need to really have a conversation. I understand his frustration about it, right? I don't know how he's taking care of his needs. And even if they can't have intercourse, can they do mutual masturbation? Can she hold him, right? While he's masturbating, or maybe she's doing that for him, but they're doing it in kind of a loving embrace so that there's still in connection with each other. There's lots of ways in which that couple can have sex. Can they have anal sex? Again, I don't know if, something happened to the pelvis where that's obviously all, the whole area is obviously all connected where that wouldn't work either. But it sounds like there's possibilities here to enjoy each other's bodies in different ways. And that is one thing that happens, as people get older, as they age and vaginas maybe start getting more atrophied and penises are not getting as hard in erect. A lot of times in working with people in their 80s, they'll talk about having outer course instead of intercourse, right? Outer course of like, playing with breasts and playing with arms and legs. For me, that's all foreplay, right? But that's like another way to experience sex. And so I think we all need to have a mindset shift paradigm of like sex is not just sticking something in a hole. It's not. And it's not just getting off on a clitoral orgasm or a G-spot orgasm or an ejaculatory orgasm. There's so many different ways to experience pleasure and just enjoy it. Even if you don't have the outcome that you're looking for, that doesn't mean that your body doesn't feel amazing. The endorphins aren't running through it. So that couple, I would recommend if they really want to get back into it, to start having some conversations, maybe work with somebody to address the different ways in which they can have a lot of sexual pleasure, leaving the vagina out of it.
I love that. Yeah, that reminds me of we did an episode with another woman in Canada. God bless these Canadian friends of ours. And she talked about body mapping because it was about why is it taboo to talk about sex if you have a disability. And that was the first thing that came to mind when you were talking about Outercourse, is doing some body mapping to figure out what's fun and what's funner.
Yeah. And the other piece of this is, and you'd have to do a whole nother podcast on this, is sex can also be energetic, right? So this is like tantric sex and sacred sexuality, a couple like that. If they'd be open to it, I'd say like try tantra, right? It doesn't have to involve any genitals. You can actually have full body orgasm experience without genital connection or touch. You can start to like really work on the energy between you and have amazing sexual experiences that way. That I find for a lot of couples, they just love that and really have great connections that way, and also has like a spiritual component to it as well. So there's lots of options on the table.
One listener says, I'm newly menopausal, no libido and pain now. It sucks. What do I do?
I would get support for the menopausal symptoms, right? So, for women, HRT, they can use it. There's more and more evidence and research that says that most women, as they start to enter menopause, should be on some sort of estrogen therapy, not just for your libido, but for osteoporosis and a lot of other conditions that happen as women age in particular. So I would first get some medical support around that. Sometimes acupuncture can be very helpful. It hurts because the vagina is starting to dry up because there's insufficient estrogen, right? So estrogen creams, there are some non-estrogen suppositories that naturopaths, functional medicine folks, if you're estrogen sensitive or you can't take it, can also prescribe. That can be also very helpful. Lots of moisturizer. There's and I have no affiliation with them at all. What's it called? VMagic, VMAGIC, is a product that my gynecologist recommended to me because I was having problems, and I have found to be extremely helpful. There's a medical device called a VFit, VFIT, which I also use on a regular basis, and I recommend this for all women who are menopausal. You insert it inside of your vagina, and it has a red light technology, and that red light helps to really innervate and bring more blood to the vaginal tissues to create more lubrication. So there are plenty of alternatives and things that you can do as you're going through menopause to start to settle things. You lose your libido because you have a loss of estrogen, right? So a lot of this is hormonal and can be addressed with hormonal supplements, which I started hormone therapy at age 63. And it's made a huge difference as well for me, both in terms of my libido and my tissues are much moisture, sex is much more comfortable, so you got to work at it. Unfortunately, our body changes, right? We've got to support it with all of these different ways.
I think it's the work part that is a big hang up for a lot of women, at least, who may not be enjoying equal gender roles or workload. They might have the majority of the invisible workload, the emotional workload, and carry jobs at the same time. So the idea of working at this area and their body betraying them, it just feels really angering, I think. So I really have a lot of compassion for women that are just like, I just can't. But I love that the idea of bringing someone like you into the picture and offering that support. So I have one more listener question, and then I'd love for you to share how people can get that support from you.
Sure.
So this last listener question says, I used to be someone who wanted it all the time. Then depression from a very unexpected divorce, menopause, COVID, etc. I never want it now. I will say that my current partner of 6 years does not give any other attention. No cuddling, no hand holding, nothing. I think that has a good bit to do with it too.
I think she hit it right on the nail. Certainly, depression, a change in mental state, can absolutely affect your desire for sex, for sure. Some of the SSRIs that people are put on are also very depress your libido. So I've definitely seen that's a real thing. A lot of medicines depress libido as well, right? It's a unknown, known side effect that maybe doctors won't tell you. But, I always ask people like, what are you on? Did you notice a change in libido since you started taking that medicine? But I think what she's saying is really the key component here is that she wants the emotional connection. She wants to be cuddled. She doesn't want to be seen as just a sex object. She wants to be seen as like somebody who can be taken care of, who can be nurtured, who can cuddle with their partner, who can have more intimate, non-sexual connections. And I think that's really important for couples to make space for non-sexual but intimate connections that really keeps the fire going, and it continues to create the emotional connection and the emotional safety that we all need in order to be able to have an amazing relationship and connection.
You're so knowledgeable in all of this. I just am having a hard time remembering that this is the same person that I introduced, an hour ago as we didn't have sex for 2 decades. Because you're like, oh, and kink and this. And then, it's so, I hope this gives people a lot of hope, and certainly introducing your support into their life can be a way that they can approach this topic without feeling an unnecessary amount of burden. And so tell people how they can do that. I know you've got retreats. Is that the only way that they can work with you?
Couples primarily, I do like doing retreats because they're over a 4-day period of time. These are individual retreats or my week-long international retreats. Because honestly, like having the opportunity to take a really deep dive with a couple over a weekend, over 4 days, where like when their stuff comes up, we get to deal with it right away. And they're in this, kind of bubble with me. It really makes a difference. Like the transformation that I've seen in couples that come and do retreats is tremendous. I'll work with my retreat couples post-retreat if they need follow-up and support, but I've stopped doing individual coaching with couples on a weekly basis. So I think if you're a couple that's struggling in a sexless marriage, or you're really having relationship issues that are affecting your sex life, if you wanted to work with me, coming and doing an intimacy retreat in Asheville would be like your best step. I do have a book, which is called Living an Orgasmic Life, Heal Yourself and Awaken Your Pleasure. That actually talks about my own specific healing journey, but also has very specific exercises and practices that you can do. And I also use examples of lots of different couples, women and men as well. And then I do a little bit of individual coaching, primarily with women. And that's through my other website, which is powerpleasure.com. My intimacy website is passionateintimacyretreats.com. But really, if you just put my name in Google, you'll find all of that.
You have a delightfully unique name. That is helpful, I will say. Thank you so very much for sharing so much of your personal story and your wisdom. This was wonderful.
Thank you, Meredith. Thanks for asking such great questions. And thank you to your listeners who had great questions to ask. I really love that you have so much interaction and feedback. This was just an awesome experience.
Thanks for listening. If you've loved a couple episodes of the show, help me let others know about it by leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. You can just share where you're listening from and why you liked a certain episode. If you're listening on Spotify, you can't leave a written review, but you can leave a rating, and that's equally appreciated. And if you liked this episode, you probably like questioning things that normally go unchallenged. And if that's the case, you'll also like the episode with the psychiatrist who is also a swinger. We asked the question, what is monogamy anyway? That's episode 214. Stay tuned next week for the first ever debate episode featuring a cyber psychologist and a tech entrepreneur as they discuss the ethics of grief bots. Until then, keep it curious.